Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 812, June the 29th, 1987. I'm having a problem answering my mail, and before I get into the regular part of the broadcast, I just have to explain it's impossible to answer all the letters that are coming in. I have them piled up back to last August, which is really very depressing. So I'm going to ask you, if possible, to tape this off the air if you hear World Watchers on the air, and then play back the tape to get the sources of references for articles and I'll give them as much as I can remember to do on each broadcast, because I no longer can pull out articles, copy them, and answer the individual letters. The boxes of mail I have are just too huge, and for those of you who sent self-addressed stamped envelopes for the bibliography sheets, I'm going to return the money and discontinue that, and you'll have to take the bibliography off of the air. A very important article from Newsday was in the San Francisco Chronicle this morning, June the 29th, 1987, titled Ex-CIA Aide Linked to Contra Drug Fund. This is very important for the Christic Institute suit, and it is important for the linkage of the person they're writing about in this article, Felix Rodriguez, to Vice President George Bush and the entire Republican Party, the hierarchy in Washington. The article says a money launderer for the major Colombia cocaine cartel, that's the Medellin cartel, has told Congress in secret sworn testimony that he funneled nearly $10 million to the Nicaraguan Contras through former CIA operative Felix Rodriguez, and the congressional sources are passing this on. This gentleman testified behind closed doors before the Senate Narcotics Terrorism Subcommittee on Thursday and Friday. Ramon Rodriguez is serving 35 years for racketeering and for charges related to narcotics money laundering, and he said the Medellin cartel believed it was currying favor with the Central Intelligence Agency when it directed him to give the cash of the cocaine profits and money to Mr. Felix Rodriguez. Rodriguez, I don't assume they're relatives, with the same last name, testified that the money was delivered in several installments after 1983 when he was arrested. The subcommittee source said that Rodriguez claimed he passed the money in Central America to those couriers who were selected by Felix Rodriguez. And the interesting part about this, of course, Felix Rodriguez, otherwise known as Max Gomez, is one of my particular favorite characters out of this entire Iran-Contra scandal because of his wearing Che Guevara's watch band, his working in Bolivia with Klaus Barbie and the death squads, his closeness to Vice President George Bush, and also this article says it tells about how when he worked at Elipango Air Force in El Salvador, and this is where the airdrops were made. The airdrops were part of an enterprise financed by the United States sale of missiles to Iran, and General Secord and Albert Hakim, his associates, have testified before the Iran-Contra hearings, as well as Felix Rodriguez, and Mr. Eugene Hasenfuss worked with Felix Rodriguez in these airlifts at the time that he fell down in Nicaragua. Eugene Hasenfuss, I did many broadcasts about him. As soon as he landed in Nicaragua, the former Attorney General under Jimmy Carter, Griffin Bell, went down to rescue him. It was pretty heavyweight for a otherwise unknown, was supposed to be an unknown person in this entire operation of funding the Contras right out of the White House. And after Griffin Bell went there, I cited on the air articles that Griffin Bell was on the board of and very much a part of the brokerage firm of E.F. Hutton, and that the chairman of E.F. Hutton at the time that these large narcotics deposits were made by both Klaus Barbie and Joseph Mengele out of Brazil and Bolivia went into E.F. Hutton, and the chairman was Scott Pierce, the brother-in-law of George Bush, Barbara Bush's brother. He stepped down since then. And also a good hunk of the narcotic money went into Merrill Lynch, and Donald Reagan was chairman of Merrill Lynch before he became Secretary of the Treasury, and then Chief of Staff of the White House. And in the testimony of Mr. Hakim, he told how Felix Rodriguez had access to the vice president's office, went in there, and George Bush then admitted that he'd been in there twice and that he was very high up in Washington and if he had any concerns, he didn't take them through certain channels regarding the arming of the Contras or any other matter. He went directly to the White House. This Felix Rodriguez was the cute little guy who held up the big flag with the sickle showing that the Soviets were in Central America. He pulled out his red flag at the time of the hearing and thought he was being very dramatic and cute. There's an article in Guardian this month, June 24th, 1987, called The Great George Bush Vanishing Act. And one of the biggest scandals of the entire Iran-Contra is the lack of any mention of George Bush being at any meetings. They'll refer to the meeting of the Big Five, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the head of the CIA, the NSC, the President. But they're carefully avoiding George Bush. And I won't cite most of this article on this particular program, but it says, it states the documented role of Bush's staff in the scandal dates back to November 3rd, 1983, when Bush's top advisor and former CIA agent Donald Gregg, G-R-E-G-G, met with Contra airlift manager and former CIA agent Felix Rodriguez to discuss the situation in Central America, according to their self-serving chronology published in Bush's office. Rodriguez and Gregg had worked together in the 1970s as operatives in the CIA's infamous Operation Phoenix, which murdered tens of thousands of Vietnamese civilians in southern Vietnam. And then Rodriguez goes on to work with top-level Bush staff. He was in and out of the White House. He had access to George Bush, and on at least 3 occasions Rodriguez met with Bush himself. And, of course, the relationship of Gregg and the CIA and Vietnam and Bush as CIA director is very, very close. And the date here in this article was November 3rd, 83, when the staff started meeting with Felix Rodriguez. And remember, Bush was CIA director earlier in 1976-77. Che Guevara was killed in 67 by Felix Rodriguez, who also worked at the Bay of Pigs with these people and met earlier with the anti-Castro Cubans at the time of the Bay of Pigs. So this person testifying now before committees in Congress talks about the CIA being pleased that cocaine money profits was going to the Contras and that it was going through Mr. Felix Rodriguez. And, of course, I've done many broadcasts on the allegations or the information I had about George Bush with Klaus Barbie and the links of the Nazi international group to the people in the White House and the cocaine traffic. There was an article that was in the newspapers today. I'm sure all of you saw it, and all of you that follow World Watchers. Althea Flynt, the wife of Larry Flynt, was found dead in a bathtub, 33 years old, passed away this weekend. I'm going to do a lot more on the chronology of the Flynts again. When I met Larry Flynt in 1983, a lot of people didn't understand why Mae Brussell got into writing an article for Hustler magazine about Korean Airline, but I had a particular reason, and I'll state it again. I had called Larry Flynt and said, you know, the man that went down on that airplane, Larry McDonald from Georgia, had close relationships and worked with Joseph Paul Franklin, the man that shot you, that paralyzed you when you were in Atlanta or outside of Atlanta in Georgia at a trial, obscenity pornography publication trial. And I said, would you like the real story on the real Larry McDonald and the Korean airline and the meaning of this particular incident? And, of course, he was very interested in it, and we were on the telephone almost every day. I could hardly write the article. He was on the telephone calling me all of the time. And since that time when I met him about 2 years ago, Joseph Paul Franklin did confess that he was, in fact, the person who had shot Larry Flynt. And I was one of the first people in the United States that knew or had made the connections, and Larry Flynt had a lot of good security team, and he didn't know how I, sitting in Carmel without any help from anybody else except what I read and put together, knew who had shot him and paralyzed him. He never went to trial for that because the belief was that if he went to Georgia for the trial of shooting Larry Flynt, the jail keepers would let him flee, and he already is in jail for killing several couples, one couple in Salt Lake City, and he's the gentleman who shot Vernon Jordan in Ohio. He never went to a trial on that or got off on that. But the article I did was that one on the Korean airline, and I designed the Larry McDonald pie, and I really keep saying over and over again I should put this whole thing on the air and just read it to you, the importance of that, because John SINGLAUB was on the board of Western Goals, and Larry McDonald was chairman of Western Goals, the one who went down. And, of course, as soon as Larry McDonald was dead, the whole operation of Western Goals went to back to its origins in the East Coast in Washington and Maryland, the headquarters there, where Carl Spitz Channel took over, and the board of Western Goals is an entire military operation. Now, a person very active with John SINGLAUB of Western Goals was Lieutenant General Mitchell Wurbel, and Wurbel worked as the extension of our United States government, making silencers, heading up hit teams, working with the mercenaries and Robert K. Brown, who is the associate not only of General SINGLAUB, but Robert Owen, who worked out of the Robert Gray offices in Washington. If you've been listening to the testimony or hearing the programs of World Watchers, and I no sooner got onto SINGLAUB and Western Goals and started writing the article than Mitchell Wurbel moved into the home of Larry Flynt, as did Gordon Novell and G. Gordon Liddy. And these three top heavies from the military literally took over. He wanted me to do this article for Hustler, which came out in February of '84 on the KAL. But as soon as I met him, he wanted to start a magazine. He had bought the LA Free Press in 1978, published one issue, and it was about the Kennedy assassination. A few weeks later, he was shot and paralyzed, and then he wanted to start again on the Kennedy assassination and asked me to have the lead article in a new magazine that would be called The Rebel. And I'm going into the chronology next week, not this week, on what happened at that time. Some of you know it and some of you don't remember it, but on the anniversary of John Kennedy's murder, 20th anniversary, Larry Flynt got out The Rebel, but by then he was already drugged, and Althea was drugged, and they were as good as dead in terms of being public persons any longer. He was to go into federal prisons. He was crazy. I was down in Los Angeles December 16th. At that time, Althea was at Cedars-Sinai, and she was already practically out of her mind and just tangling Western Goals and the Kennedy assassination, the Nazi connections that are both related to each other, caused these people from the Defense Department to move in. And as I say, what happened to them is a good lesson to anybody who would try to tangle these things at such a high level. On my broadcast number 624, that was November 21st, 1983, and you see how fast the years go, that was 4 years ago, I suggested that Larry Flynt was already out of his mind. He had called me on November the 23rd. He was going to fly over the Pacific Ocean. He was going to drop into the ocean and die like Larry McDonald did. And I said, who is around you? I knew, and on the broadcast and with the sheet that accompanied it, I said, I know somebody has gotten into him. And then I put on the broadcast a couple of house guests moved in, one Gordon Novell and the other Mitchell Wurbel. And Gordon Novell was palling around and helping John DeLorean. John DeLorean got out of all of his lawsuits, now has $22 million from Germany to start a new car company. And Gordon Novell was involved with the Kennedy assassination and had a role down in New Orleans. Jim Garrison wanted him as a person to come to his trial of Clay Shaw. Novell was protected by Governor Rhodes of Ohio. And the allegations that I had about John DeLorean's cocaine were that it came from Klaus Barbie. And John DeLorean was traveling around until he was through with all of his problems. And I'm sure he's still very close to Gordon Novell. And Novell moved into Larry's home and into Hustler magazine. And I'll put it in some chronological order for you, because this is the end of a saga that could go nowhere once he decided to open up these raw nerves, and the system has ways of taking care of people besides just shooting them. Now, I hope some of you are watching the news very carefully to see some of the events that are happening in front of our eyes. They're happening so swiftly now that it's hard to add them up, but I think we have to take time and add them up and visualize what we're seeing, because what we're seeing now is only going to portend what the future is going to bring to us. Number one, June 13th, just this past week, Ronald Reagan was at the Berlin Wall, or just within 2 weeks ago, saying, tear down the wall. It's the only time that a president of the United States has been in Berlin 2 times. Most of them visit once, saying, tear down the wall. The Los Angeles Herald had an article June 15th, 1987. Reagan says it's time to unite the two Germanys. We're going to make them one. June the 14th, 1987, Richard von Weizsacker was the guest at Harvard University, and I mentioned that on the programs as the guest speaker at graduation, and his father, Baron von Weizsacker, was the liaison of Adolf Hitler and the Vatican and had a role in the Battle of the Bulge, which involved George Patton and General Fritz Kramer, and the American Fritz Kramer and George Patton II was the one in that battle. George Patton III is on the board of Western Goals with John SINGLAUB, Admiral Moore, and a long list of who's who of military persons. The next item, Pope John Paul II was in Poland, closer to Moscow than ever, just hardly, I think he was about 30 miles from the Russian border. He was kissing the graves of a Solidarity victim. And there was an article in the Miami Herald, June the 7th, Pope sees Polish trip as a way to penetrate Soviet empire. The next item is that Ronald Reagan is preparing to make war in the Persian Gulf. He wants to get rid of the head of the government, Mr. Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini, and the Pahlavi family would be restated on the throne. And the Pahlavi father was a pro-Nazi, worked with Adolf Hitler during the war. He was so Nazi that when Chase Manhattan, the CIA, and the powers that be overthrew Mossadegh and put the Pahlavi family into power, the father had to move to South Africa. And we're getting ready to take over Iran. You might have read June 29th that a group of Iranians were working with Oliver North to assassinate Ayatollah Khomeini. That was in U.S. News and World Report. And the San Francisco Examiner had a story June 24th, North plans to assassinate Iranian officials. So we're getting ready to move into Iran and retake the territory that we had established as our base back in 1954. Also, Pope John Paul II has invited and already entertained Mr. Waldheim, who came from Austria, and you saw their smiling face in all the papers. San Francisco Chronicle had a big lead article, Pope praises Waldheim, and it shows him holding hands, and he's calling him a man of peace. Following that, you might have seen a picture in this morning's paper of Premier Nguyen Ka Ky and General Westmoreland, both dressed in their tuxedos and grand marshals for a parade in New Orleans, the home base of Gordon Novell and the powers that be down there. 2,000 Americans and South Vietnamese veterans in Vietnam War marched together for the first time in a parade led by General Westmoreland and former South Vietnamese Premier Nguyen Ka Ky. Now, Ky is the one who kept pictures of Adolf Hitler over his desk, and he has been accused of being involved with heavy narcotic traffic coming in from Asia, and he lives in California, of course. We have a large number of very political screwballs out on the West Coast. We have our fair share. The parade in New Orleans had the U.S. Rangers, the fellows that invaded Grenada and killed Maurice Bishop, the U.S. Air Force, the Vietnamese Navy, the Vietnamese Marines. It stretched 2 miles. Ky and Westmoreland, one was commander of the U.S. forces, one of Vietnam. They were marshals in the parade, and they talked about the historic beginning of an annual parade. Ky lives in Huntington Beach. He called for the liberation of Vietnam. 90% of the Vietnamese people are waiting for him. We must be free and unify all Vietnam, Ky said. They are waiting for us in North Vietnam. And the Vietnamese in California, I don't know about in other states, are training, and with American help, to go back to Vietnam and take Vietnam, because in this grand strategy of a 1,000-year Reich, it includes every country, not a few. Also, in this morning's paper that was so filled with material, I already had decided what I wanted to use for this evening, but I am forced to look at what today has because it ties in with a lot of things that I've been talking about for years. San Francisco Chronicle, Washington Post. Sensitive technology. The United States to let Egypt build the best American tank. Israel was not consulted. They may object. The Reagan administration has agreed to allow Egypt to produce the United States top-of-the-line main battle tank, the F-1A1 Abrams in a move that will transfer sensitive technology to the Middle East capital and support Egypt's bid to become the dominant arms merchant in the Arab world. Now, as soon as Ronald Reagan was in 1981 and Alexander Haig was Secretary of State, it was quickly arranged for Mr. Sadat to be murdered, for Mr. Mubarak to be put into position, and Mr. Abu Ghazala, who sat on one side of Mubarak, who wasn't touched by a weapon in the barrage of shots that came down, has been arranging this affair with Caspar Weinberger and Mr. Armitage of the Defense Department, Richard Armitage, and who's the Assistant Secretary for International Affairs, with Caspar Weinberger, and made a fait accompli that this is arranged and Egypt is going ahead with this. Armitage was mentioned by Ross Perot, who's no flaming liberal, and asked the government to investigate his narcotics traffic deals, that he has been tied up in narcotics, and Caspar Weinberger said Armitage is too important to this deal, not this deal, the Egyptian, but he's too important and we won't touch it. And Ross Perot thought if the First Lady wants to stop drugs, and she's saying just say no, you can't have the deputy of the Assistant Secretary for International Security Affairs, Mr. Armitage, involved in these things. And Armitage was involved with Mr. Calero and the Contras, donating $90,000 or more and paying the drug enforcement agents and going over to Lebanon under the guise of wanting to get a hostage, a very controversial deal of the CIA paying the DEA. That involved Mr. Armitage, and Jack Anderson has had articles about Armitage and his questionable background, but Weinberger says he is too important. These people are totally above the law at any point now. Armitage working with Weinberger and Abu Ghazala is very important, and also Abu Ghazala and the role that he played with Mubarak when Sadat was murdered. Incidentally, when Robert McFarlane had his suicide attempt, which was fairly feeble, and he recovered nicely enough, I suppose, one of the few visitors he had at the hospital when it was tight security for everybody else was Madam Mrs. Sadat, the widow of Anwar Sadat, who was murdered. Now, this article on Egypt making American bombs brings up the fact that it may have a problem for the United States because the transfer of arms is a loss of a big order of tanks from the United States factories, and it will have a significant effect on American jobs. We are a captive nation, and we are putting our jobs out of this country, and we will be beholden to the powers that be to exist without the factories that make these weapons. This article also says U.S. Ambassador Frank G. Wisner has told Western officials that the importance of the program is that it represents another bond in the relationship between Egypt and between Egypt and the United States. Now, Frank G. Wisner was appointed by Ronald Reagan. If you want to know the background of Frank Wisner's father, read The Belarus Secret by John Loftus. His father was responsible for bringing most of the top Nazis from Eastern Europe to the United States that worked with the Gehlen Organization, worked with our Defense Department, moved into areas like the Dallas-Fort Worth area that were effective in covering up the assassination role of persons other than Lee Harvey Oswald. The Belarus Secret tells you about Frank Wisner, the daddy, and in the index, I copied the index, you'll see maybe 40 or 50 or 60 pages alone on his group of emigre institutes and ex-Nazis brought to the United States and the Gehlen operation. And the partner of Reinhard Gehlen was Otto von Borschwing, who came out to Silicon Valley and formed this Stanford Technology. Originally it was TCI, Transcomputer International, and its subsidiary IIS, International Imaging System, was bought by Albert Hakim with money he had in Iran, where he accumulated then Secord and Shackley, General Secord and Colonel Dutton, and CIA agent Theodore Shackley and CIA agent Thomas Kleins. So the Gehlen operation from the California end, with Ronald Reagan here as governor and their secretary as translator, Ronald Reagan's appointment secretary, Helene von Dahm, working with the Gehlen group. I think if you look really closely, you can see this net or web and how it is working. Now, can the sons of those fathers be blamed for the role that the fathers had? I've talked about Baron von Weizsacker and his son Richard von Weizsacker, who is currently president of Germany, who told Harvard just last week that his father had no role in the Nazi exterminations. There was Frank G. Wisner, and now there's Frank Wisner, his son, who's working with Caspar Weinberger and Armitage, Frank G. Wisner Jr., sending the making of American weapons to Egypt, and knowing the role of Egypt in the Middle East, closing in on Israel, and of course Israel is excluded out of all this. George Patton II was working with General Fritz Kramer. George Patton III is on Western Goals. Ollie North's father worked with George Patton II, and Ollie works with George Patton III as Western Goals became Spitz Channel's office. Carl Spitz Channels took it over, and of course Ollie North is very close to that operation. And then if you want to read more about Egypt becoming a Nazi stronghold, you have to read Galen, Spy of the Century by Kukarich, and the takeover of Otto Skorzeny and Adolf Eichmann of the northern part of North Africa and turning it into a Nazi warhead. It hasn't been many years since World War II to follow the entire pattern and the way it's flowing, to know now the way it's going. There's a report, Caspar Weinberger is begging the Japanese, please help us, they urge Japan this week, help make the next generation of fighter planes, let the United States help. They're contracting them out in Japan and not from here, they're not buying them from us. And Weinberger suggested remodeling the existing American military aircraft with the use of Japanese technology, and those would be made in Japan. And then finally, along flowing those lines, there's Henry Kissinger shopping for a canal, an article that was published by Warren Howe from Spotlight. Henry Kissinger made a trip to Central America in February to buy the Panama Canal, not on his behalf or for Henry Kissinger's associates, but it's for a consortium, Tokyo Group, a powerful industrial bank, and the Japanese government. And the Japanese are planning the acquisition and development of 500 square miles of prime real estate surrounding the canal. To sweeten the deal, they have offered to modernize Panama's century-old railroad, all financed by Japan at a cost of $1.4 billion. The Japanese are off on the greatest worldwide takeover raid since World War II, said Dr. Raymond Chu, a corporate economist. They are after a broad variety of American assets, and remember, Bank of America sent their officials last week to help them bail out of their problems, asking for $300 million. This article says Henry Kissinger is playing the role of an Indian scout for foreign businesses using Kissinger Associates and the Tokyo stockbrokers Nomura, Nikao, Yamayachi, and Daiwa are major players on Wall Street. They have now opened the Big Four, their branches on Wall Street that wasn't allowed before. In 1986, their number grew from 550 to 2,000 staffers on Wall Street, and the fee for Henry Kissinger is reward for helping the Japanese if they take over the canal, apart from other consultant honorariums, is said to be over $5 million. So there is your trilateral group. Germany, Japan, and the United States is the bottom of that triangle, holding all of the weight instead of being on top this time. Now, regarding the Pope's entertaining Mr. Waldheim, I want to discuss with you some information I gave the bishop here in Monterey. The Pope is coming here, and I went to visit him, and I took approximately 50 or 60 sheets from my broadcast where I talked specifically about the Pope. I said I can't stop his visit, but I want you to know that I thoroughly object to having him in my area, which I consider very special. As I say, not that it would matter to him, but I want you to know that this Vatican has been involved with murder, gun running, drug traffic, sending atomic bombs through the Stiebbaum operation to the Middle East, and working with Nazis during and after the World War II up to the present time. And I just want to voice my opinion as one person on how I feel about it. We'll take a 1-minute break, and I'll read to you a letter I brought with me to the bishop, what I said, and you can keep in mind the visit of Waldheim at this time with the Pope is thoroughly consistent with what I was telling the bishop about my feelings about the Pope coming here. He's going to be here on the Monterey Peninsula September 17th, where there will be 1 million people at a location, Laguna Seca, then to the mission, and then he leaves. Okay, we'll take a 1-minute break. This is Mae Brussell, and I want to get back to the Vatican, Mr. Waldheim, and some other important matters. This is Mae Brussell. It is the second half of a program called World Watchers. If you picked it up in the middle, it is program number 812. I want to apologize for new listeners who hear me use a lot of names such as Griffin Bell or Scott Pierce or Donald Reagan in terms of E.F. Hutton, and I use a lot of names in a given broadcast. But I've been on the air, this is my 17th year. Many people subscribe to the tapes or listen regularly, and so that I can get as much new information in as possible, I refer to back broadcasts or names that I've used frequently on the air, and the back broadcasts are available by tape cassette. If you want them, you can write to me for them, but I can't keep filling in every detail because it would take that whole hour to just give the background of the person I'm talking about. So I have to assume when you listen to World Watchers that you're pretty sophisticated and have an idea of who I'm talking about, and if not, just get an overview of some of the things that are happening. And one of the things that is happening is that America is not only going fascist in so many ways it's hard to keep up with them now, but the Germans and the Japanese are emerging, and people like Caspar Weinberger and George Shultz, who worked for Bechtel Corporation for many, many years as chairman, director, and so forth, were building the main buildings and contracts in Saudi Arabia, a violently anti-Semitic country that wanted to wipe out Israel, and now they're arranging for Egypt on the other side of Israel to start making these brutal tanks that could pulverize Israel in very short time. Now, I went to visit the bishop this last October. It was October the 15th, and this is the letter I gave to him, and I gave him a 3-whole notebook, as I say, with about 65 sheets of broadcasts I did about the Vatican, and I left them with him. And then after I did that, a couple of months ago, the 2 Secret Service men came to the house from down San Jose, and we visited, and they had the notebook in their hand. The bishop didn't keep it or read it. I'm sure he didn't copy it. He gave it to the Secret Service, and they talked about the security of the Pope, and I assured them that I'm not in any danger to the Pope, but I have a right to express some anger, and I wasn't going to just put it on the air. I wanted to tell the bishop personally. So apply what I said in writing to the bishop in September to his visiting and grinning with Mr. Waldheim this past weekend. For Bishop Shuboda, nobody in his right mind should forget the past if the past goal was a 1,000-year Reich. The people of the past, such as Hermann Abst of the Deutsche Bank and of the board of IG Farben, are still working in the Vatican with Pope John Paul II. Men such as Abst, and Abst in particular is. Baron von Weizsacker was liaison of Adolf Hitler to the Vatican. Richard von Weizsacker Jr. is current president of Germany. Weizsacker and Helmut Kohl literally forced the President of the United States to attend ceremonies at Bitburg Cemetery, burial place of many Waffen SS. Francois Junot, financier for Adolf Hitler, Martin Bormann, and Joseph Goebbels, hired attorney Jacques Verge when the trial for Klaus Barbie was to begin. Barbie's passage to Bolivia was because of Vatican assistance. Junot hired Verge as attorney for recent terrorists in Paris, such as George Abdullah. That's the Direct Action Group, which is a right-left disguised as left terrorist group. The Vatican entertains, recognizes Mr. Arafat of the PLO, also Iraq Grand Mufti, the heirs to the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was in the Waffen SS, Hitler's SS. And I said they are currently bombing, hijacking, killing, and they are the world's worst terrorists. The past is not dead. Junot and his Knights of Malta from the Vatican connections talk of a 1,000-year Reich surviving, and they're doing very well without even having another war. Pope John Paul II worked for Solvay Chemical, which was IG Farben, during the war. When the Vatican Bank and Paul Marcinkus became connected by way of Stiebbaum, that organization with Henry Arsan, to gun running, to contracting for atomic bombs for Saudi Arabia, for drug traffic, Pope John Paul II brought to the Vatican Bank his old boss paymaster, Hermann, paymaster for the Waffen-SS and IG Farben. The past wasn't buried. The past is now, sincerely, Mae Brussell. And as I say, I gave him a lot of sheets. I gave him one from 1978. That's 9 years ago, broadcast 362, with a map of Poland and references of Adolf Hitler's books and books on IG Farben, because John Paul II worked for IG Farben. I gave a chronology of the various popes, which of course he had, and books and articles on the poisoning of John Paul I. Los Angeles Times, October the 6th, 1978. Amazingly large number of people are raising the possibility of poison in connection with Pope John Paul's death, and I gave him a lot of articles on the murder of John Paul coming from New York Times and Wall Street Journal, LA Times. And then I gave him some sheets of broadcasts going back to 1978 of Martin Bormann and how he left Europe with the help of the Vatican and went down to South America, and information about Michele Sindona and his investing the Vatican bank money. And Michele Sindona is part of a very important triangle working with David Graver from Argentina and Robert Vesco, who's very much involved in the Central American operations, and the Vatican and J. Peter Grace and the Catholic organizations have a big role in maintaining this literal slave labor relationship of people to their own countries down in South and Central America. And then I gave him some material from various articles and sources, and I said, as this goes back to 1979, watch this Pope's political acts or his non-acts towards fascists. Don't be fooled by baby kissing, ground kissing, public relations handouts. Nobody could live under the Nazis the way he did and see and smell so much death and torture under his eyes and nose because he worked at Auschwitz, which was Auschwitz, where the mass exterminations went on. He could not be so violently anti-communist and never speak out against the Nazis. Well, since then he has entered one synagogue in Rome, which no pope has ever done, and he can always say, I entered the synagogue. Now, one other article should be a warning if what I said about this pope is true or the way this country is going, our Defense Department and so on. There was an article from Reuters published in San Francisco Chronicle, June the 16th, titled, Japanese Mogul Underwriting Space Center. The University of Houston, Texas will get $3 million from a Japanese foundation funded by Ryoichi Sasakawa. $1 million has come in from Japan Shipbuilding Industry Foundation. This experimental architectural center will be renamed in Houston, Texas, for the space program area, the Sasakawa International Center for Space Architecture, in honor of the foundation's 87-year-old chairman, Ryoichi Sasakawa. Sasakawa, according to this article, is interested in the design of space stations and stations on the moon, bases on the moon, and vehicles that take humans to Mars and to the moon. Recently, Ryoichi Sasakawa contributed to the eradication of smallpox and got the United Nations Peace Medal. Now, Ryoichi Sasakawa is one of the persons very active in AIDS, and Elizabeth Taylor had a party or went to Japan to see him with AIDS, and he's putting a lot of money into AIDS research. The San Francisco Progress has a picture that somebody sent to me of Dianne Feinstein shaking the hands of Ryoichi Sasakawa. This 87-year-old is very alert and very active. This was published May 31st. Humanitarian visits City Hall. Mayor Dianne Feinstein shakes hands with widely renowned philanthropist Ryoichi Sasakawa. He intends to present $1 million to the American Foundation for AIDS Research and pledge at least $8 million more every year for a cure for AIDS until it's found. Over the last 12 years, he donated approximately $12 billion to charities. In return, the mayor gave him a package, which he had in his hand, which was a piece of cable from the Golden Gate Bridge. That's what you give to the man who has everything. And for those of you who don't know why Ryoichi Sasakawa would be working on Mars and space stations, remember the book Alternative 3? I did about 4 broadcasts on that, written by Leslie Watkins, that the purpose of the space stations was genocide and to get rid of 80% of the Earth's population was one of the catches involved in using for some way of dispersing population. But you don't have to ship people on a one-way trip to Mars. That's a little expensive. All you have to do, maybe, is reduce the Earth's population with something like AIDS that gets rid of all the people in Africa and then Asia and all those places that you don't want the people around, but you want the resources and the oil. The Earth is shrinking, and we're short of resources. And Ryoichi Sasakawa is busy in AIDS. He's busy in Mars and moons. And let me just remind you, for those of you who forget it, because this was a long time ago, there was an article in 1983 again. These years go so fast. We're 5 years back, by Alec Dubrow and David Kaplan in the Village Voice on Ryoichi Sasakawa. This article details Sasakawa's early work in the 30s, setting up assassination teams against politicians, identical to what Adolf Hitler was doing with the Freikorps, how they were setting up moderate government officials by the political party, the Kikuchi Taishido, I don't know if I pronounced that right, and that there were plots against all the high officials and murdered those people, probably in the way of invading China and continuing, leading to the Pearl Harbor attack against the United States. Sasakawa was involved in blackmail and spying. He was spying on those people who expressed dangerous thoughts about Japan's future. In 1936, in Fortune magazine, Sasakawa was charged with having made thousands of yen out of the general fear of intimidations and disloyalty. He was arrested by the Japanese authorities in 1942. He was elected to the Japanese wartime parliament, and he helped with the invasion of Southeast Asia. His party wore black shirts identical to Italy's Mussolini. They made fortunes identical to Italy, plundering strategic material from the war, went into China, and he had an operations legal section, keeping the things that they had taken from all these countries, and was active with the fascist parties throughout the entire war. He was called by authorities a Class A war criminal. He was charged with crimes against the peace. He participated in conspiracies for preparation and aggression of war, and the U.S. report by Douglas MacArthur's staff said that he was hired by the Imperial Navy and played an important part in death watches and so forth. December the 11th, 1945, he was interrogated by MacArthur's staff. They finished their report on Sasakawa was 46 years old, and the summary said he appears to be a man potentially dangerous to Japan's political future. He has been squarely behind Japanese military policies of aggression and anti-foreignism for more than 20 years. He's a man of wealth. He's not too scrupulous about its uses. He wants continued power, and he's not above wearing any new cloak that opportunism may bring him. He was released with 18 others. He was never brought to trial. He spent 3 years in prison, and then they were all released, and then he begins working with the United States government, and U.S. intelligence makes a deal just like Klaus Barbie. So the fascists from the 30s continued right on till 1987, and the stated goals of one in terms of what to do with wiping out population, I'm sure is just absolutely coincidental. Do you believe that with his interest in AIDS or in Mars, or fits in his opportunity to use disease as a method of endearing himself to various people, continues to be a threat given his mindset and the track record of these people of who they worked with before and continue to work with now at the present time. Now, a week ago, June 19th, I was shocked to read an article by James Kilpatrick titled, "If Only Reagan Had a Chance to Appoint More Justices." I was shocked by the tone of the article. It said Ronald Reagan has had his full share of disappointments over the past 6.5 years. Federal deficits remain large. Farm problems grow worse. The trade imbalance is a headache. The Iran-Contra affair is a mess. But one disappointment may outrank all the others. Reagan has been only able to name 2 new members of the U.S. Supreme Court. By this time, if we were to take history as a guide, he should have had better luck. In a little more than 3 terms in office, he cites what Roosevelt did and Harding. Reagan, he said, has only had Sandra Day O'Connor and Antonin Scalia to carry his flag into the 21st century. It seems hardly fair, writes James Kirkpatrick. After all, William Brennan is 81 in April. Lewis Powell will be 80 in September. Thurgood Marshall will be 79 next month. Harry Blackmun turned 79 in November. It does not seem reasonable Or is it unreasonable to suppose that by this time some of these distinguished gentlemen might have retired or been summoned to a yet higher court? There they sit, unperturbed, contented as frogs on a lily pad, while time passes and opportunity shrinks. And 7 days later, the court is rearranged, and now we're in a question of who to replace with Justice Powell, and he steps down. He may be sick of colon cancer, he may not be sick of colon cancer, but he has stepped down. What were the decisions of he's almost liberal, Mr. Powell. Last week they passed a decision that if you have private property facing the ocean, that people can't have a passway through your property to have access to the beach. Do you know what that means? And if you haven't figured it out, sit a while and get yourself a wading pool at Sears Roebuck. There's another decision, San Francisco Chronicle this past week. High Court reaffirms military immunity. LSD dose soldier was given a person in the military was given LSD without his knowledge for purposes of experimentation, and the court voted 5-4 that he has immunity. The government has immunity from law. That in the military service, that you have the right to be experimented upon. That your life is subject to the government. This man said his life was nearly ruined by the secret tests. And Justice Antonio Scalia, Reagan's appointed justice, declared for the court that permitting this lawsuit, that when you're given LSD or poison by your government to be tested upon, would disrupt the military regime, This person said his life was ruined. It was nearly ruined by these secret tests. He has no recourse. In a bitter dissent, Justice William Brennan said the government's conduct reminded him of Nazi doctors who treated humans like laboratory animals in conducting medical experiments. Brennan noted that the Nuremberg war crimes trial determined that experimentation with unknowing human subjects is morally and legally unacceptable. And John Paul Stevens said agreed about this. But Sandra Day, Reagan's appointee, said that this is her statement in a separate dissent, that she said conduct of this type alleged in this case is so far beyond the bounds of human decency that as a matter of law, it sadly can't be considered as part of a military mission. You can't protect people who are given chemicals by the government because it's not even hardly possible. And this person said the purpose of the test was to examine the use of gas masks and protective clothing, and that he was at Aberdeen Proving Ground, and he said the real intent was his unwitting reaction to psychedelic substance, lysergic acid, diethylamide, and the government was interested in finding whether the drugs could be used to force captured soldiers to talk freely. And on 4 occasions he drank LSD, and the experience nearly destroyed him, and he had hallucinations and episodes of it, and he'd wake up from sleep at night and beat his wife and children, couldn't recall the incident, and his mind had been affected. He lives now in Florida, and in 1969 he was having problems with his family. He learned about the experiments in 1975, what they were doing to them, and the Supreme Court says, we don't pay you back anything. You belong to the country. We can do anything we want with your head. And the decision was passed that the Supreme Court owes nobody anything for what they do to them. And at the same time, the Supreme Court ruled that families of workers exposed to nuclear tests can't sue the U.S. court. Survivors of government employees who develop cancer from radiation of atmospheric nuclear testing cannot sue the government or its contractees for damages. In a landmark decision that could bar legal compensation for 250,000 workers exposed during atomic weapons tests, the court ruled that they're not going to take responsibility for those cancers. You're on your own, and even if you died of leukemia or your family did, and they had follow-ups, that's too bad. Tough buns. We're not going to be interested in you. So what has happened with Richard Nixon's appointment of the court and Ronald Reagan's appointments to the court, you have a court that says your property can block the ocean, your government can drug you, and it can put chemicals in the atmosphere. You have no recourse to sue. You live in the United States of America, and this is what we do. And if this is what we do, this is what you're going to get. Now, last week, I was all excited because Michael Ledeen would be a witness testifying. Ledeen can't be testifying for many, many reasons. I'll cite just one of them and do much more on this later. I don't want to do the remaining part of the broadcast. But a big story broke in 1985 about the arrest of persons involved in selling arms to Iran. It involved Paul Seshola out here on the West Coast, who also uses the name Cutter. San Jose Mercury had a long story by Pete Carey and Alan Gaithright, published August the 9th, 1985. Alleged arms smuggler Paul Seshola met in Israel with Defense Minister Ariel Sharon in 1982 and devised a scheme to sell the captured weapons from the Israeli invasion in Lebanon to Iran. Seshola and 6 others were charged for conspiracy to sell to Iran. That's Paul Cutter. And this Paul Cutter had gone to Israel with one of our top military generals. He visited the Jewish Institute of National Security, known as JINSA, J-I-N-S-A, and Michael Ledeen is very much a part of JINSA. He works with the Mossad and with the U.S. intelligence. JINSA was formed in 1976. There's 1,200 members, and among them is a Dr. Stephen Bryan, who was Assistant Secretary of Defense in 1981 and worked with the Mossad, and he continues to work with the Defense Department. Seshola worked with Lieutenant General Eugene Tighe, T-I-G-H-E Jr., Chief of U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency. From 1971 to 81, the DIA and the State Department and the Mossad and the National Security were sending arms to Iran during the period 1983, and they were told in Israel it was okay to do it. This is a long article about JINSA and about drug smuggling and how one group got arrested and the other were sending arms out of the White House. And, of course, the group that got arrested worked with Cyrus Hashemi, who was murdered in London, and I keep saying I'll update that story. Now, Michael Ledeen, I've mentioned on other programs, is a part of the Super Sees Me in Italy. He traveled with Henry Kissinger over in Italy, accompanied him in a time period in 1984. They were traveling together, and according to one article, this character, Michael Ledeen, was an American few know about, but he works closely with the Italian Secret Service, the Sees Me, the Super S, and Michael Ledeen, the former advisor of terrorism on the United States State Department, works under, this was 1984, under Alexander Haig as an operative of Super S, and along with Francesco Pazienza, who I've mentioned is now on trial for arranging the Bologna bombing with a whole gang of other Nazis, and they blamed it on the left. There's a new article out in New Times about the murder of Aldo Moro and linking him to the United States intelligence, to a man named Ronald Stark, who's now dead, who worked with Timothy Leary. And the relationship of the Aldo Moro murder goes again to Michael Ledeen and Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig. And I'll do more on that later. But this Ledeen is so important that they don't dare let him come before the committee, and he didn't come because they don't want him to get too many perjury charges or get into heavy subjects that they would be forced to get into. There's another article by James Harrer and George Nicholas, Reagan's aides linked to spy scandal, and this is about JINSA and about Assistant Secretary of Defense Stephen Bryan and his Pentagon Post, and Paul Seshola, Paul Cutter, and General Tighe, and that organization, JINSA. I'll spell out probably as soon as I can the Jonathan Institute and the JINSA, the connections of the Israeli Mossad to the United States Defense Department, but that only works for a short while. At this point, now the Defense Department will splinter off from Israel after the Iran-Contra affair, and they very blatantly announced that Egypt will be making these tanks for the United States in Egypt, and they have not consulted Israel. That article this morning is the first noticeable slap in the face, we don't care if you exist anymore signal to the country of Israel, and Israel was doomed to get that anyway. The meeting of the Pope with Waldheim this week, the signals of this type of activity are all synchronized, all happening at the same time period, in case Israel doesn't get the message. There's one article on Reagan's aides linked to spy scandal that involves Ledeen, says that reportedly in pursuit of Seshola's revelations, FBI boss William Webster discovered and alerted Ronald Reagan of the unavoidable question. George Shultz and his predecessor, Alexander Haig, and former CIA Deputy Director and Defense Undersecretary Frank Carlucci, who's now Chief of Staff, and General Tighe, Chief U.S. Arms Negotiator Ambassador Max Kampelman, and a dozen other military and civilian leaders have been working with key figures of Jinsa in Israel and in the State Department and are sending arms to Iran. This was published in 1985, but has to do with the shipment of Iran weapons going as soon as Ronald Reagan was president, the continuous shipment of arms to Iran, and then finally the arrest of these people after they were well known and worked together, Seshola, Ladine, Bryan, and Teague, who all were board members of Jinsa, and worked together this strange assortment of our Defense Department, a Mossad organization, and Michael Ladine, Ronald Reagan's links going back earlier to Iran and weapons and entering into Lebanon, Alexander Haig telling Israel they could do it and then take the weapons and sell the weapons to Iran, I believe is part and parcel of the deal of holding the hostages until after the election so Reagan could become president. Incidentally, if you have in these times, Barbara Honegger from Pacific Grove has a front-page article on the hostage and the selling of the election and Ronald Reagan's transfer of arms by various means, the deals that were cut in 1980 that started in 1980. And, of course, this material about Ladine fits in, and I'll go more on that article in a little while. Many of you get in these times. If not, I suggest you try and subscribe to it because they're having very important material. One final article that I'll only have time for now, Warren Hinkle from the San Francisco Examiner yesterday is talking about the cover-ups of the Iran-Contra affair, and they're talking about Charles Cooper and his revelations and testimony about cover-ups of he spoke from the point of view of the Justice Department and the various changing of documents and the covering up, saying they were oil drills and they weren't, that they were actually arms for Iran. But Warren Hinkle, who was former publisher of Ramparts magazine in its robust, inquisitive days, said, "It is not the Contra cover-up number one that is bothering the people in Washington or in Miami, the Charles Cooper allegations or the others about the Ayatollah weapons being disguised as oil drills. The bigger cover-up is the one in Miami, cover-up number 2, and it is yet to be presented to the country in any significant detail. Contragate number 2 is more damning to Edwin Meese and Ronald Reagan because it ties the whole dirty business directly to illegal gun running in the United States and drug trafficking and profiteering on the part of the Contras, the Gippers' moral equivalent of the Founding Fathers." And this goes back to the story this morning about Gomez Rodriguez and the Medellin cartel and cocaine money, $10 million to the Contras. Warren Hinkle says congressional testimony has established that Edwin Meese in 1986 put the brakes on and stopped an FBI justice investigation into illegal arms and drug shipments into Florida and Costa Rica involving the Contras and the Central Intelligence Agency. The motive was to hold off any adverse publicity until Congress voted $100 million to the Contras. The implications of the delay in terms of potential obstruction of justice are staggering. The general lack of attention on the part of the press of cover-up 2 may finally be the one that brings down the entire Contra house of cards on the Gippers' beautiful head and extends to the harassment of people who disclosed the mess in the first place. That's Martha Honey and Tony Abergan, who have filed a suit that the Christic Institute is handling. This article continues. The Christic Institute in Washington, D.C. filed a whopper lawsuit 2 years ago on the part of 2 journalists injured in a bombing to get Eden Pastor in 1984. The suit laid out the secret government behind the Contra corruption and named all but the bid players, including Norris Secord and the rest of the reindeer. In late May, a Christic Institute secretary and lawyer were arrested in Costa Rica. They picked up a package at the post office that they thought was for them, for not knowing what it was, and there was dope in it, and immediately the Costa Rica police were there trying to blame them for receiving narcotics. Warren Hinkle concludes it was a clear setup and a clear harassment that the press opted to ignore. When you first stick your head in the sand, it is only a question of how far you want to go. And in terms of ignoring it, there was the testimony of Glenn Robinette that he was receiving from General Secord $4,000 a month, monthly expenses to get the dirt and to get Martha Honey and Tony Abergan and frame them. And this is a instance of their desperation. The problem is that that money, and he also came to a figure of 11,000, and the Congressional Committee asked Mr. Robinette, what did you do with 11,000 down there? It's 1,000 to get to Costa Rica and back, or even 1,000 each way. Well, the point is that Robert Owen, a courier for these people, another defendant in this suit, we have under sworn testimony, was at the home of Robert K. Brown, the man who puts out Soldier of Fortune and hires the narcs. And the question there is, how careful do they have to be with SINGLAUB and Brown and Owen and these hit teams working to protect their own lives besides having the drugs put on them? Well, our time is up now. I have to speak quickly to get in 1/10 of what I want to tell you in 1 hour. Forgive me for that. This is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week to continue with World Watchers.